the moment Alice Ralston's mare lifted her right foreleg and refused to set it down again. Alice knew with a cold certainty that the next 12 miles to Harlan Creek were going to be the longest of her life. She had left the Drummond homestead before first light, carrying 36 jars of preserved peaches and a folded letter from the telegraph office tucked against her ribs, a letter she had not yet allowed herself to read because she was afraid of what it would say about her father's condition. The Kansas morning had been promising when she set out, all pale gold and clean wind, the kind of morning that made a person believe the territory was not trying to kill them. But the sun had climbed higher, and the trail had grown rockier through the dry creek bed passage, and now her bay mare, Clover, stood on 3 legs in the middle of the Cimarron Flats with her head hanging and her eyes full of a dull, resigned pain that Alice recognized, because she felt something similar herself most days. She climbed down from the saddle and ran her hand along Clover's leg, pressing gently at the fetlock, and the mare flinched but did not cry out. It was not broken. That was the single mercy available in this moment. But it was badly strained, the kind of strain that could become something permanent and ugly if Alice tried to push the animal forward. And Alice Ralston was 23 years old and had grown up on the Kansas frontier, and she knew the difference between a horse you could coax and a horse you had to protect from yourself. She straightened up and looked at the horizon in all 4 directions, and the horizon said nothing useful back to her. Scrub grass and limestone and the occasional skeletal cottonwood, and somewhere behind her to the northwest, a thin column of dust that meant a rider. She pulled Clover's reins over the mare's head and walked her gently to a patch of taller grass beside a flat boulder and let the animal graze. Then she sat on the boulder and took the letter from inside her coat and stared at it. The envelope was addressed in her sister Margaret's careful handwriting, which meant Margaret had dictated it to someone at the telegraph office, and they had written it out by hand, and the formality of that process made Alice's chest ache with something she could not name. She put the letter back without opening it, not yet. She would need to be in Harlan Creek to do anything about whatever it contained, and worrying over words she could not act on served no purpose she could identify. The dust column behind her resolved itself, as she watched, into a single rider on a dark horse, moving at a comfortable lope that ate up the distance between them with the kind of easy efficiency that suggested both the horse and the rider had done this particular stretch of Kansas flatland many times before. Alice stood and raised her hand not in distress but in simple acknowledgement, the way people on the frontier did when they passed each other, because out here the acknowledgement of another living soul mattered in ways that people in St. Louis or Cincinnati would never fully understand. The rider slowed when he was close enough to see Clover's posture, and he pulled his horse to a walk and came the last 50 yards at a careful pace, reading the situation as he came. He was tall in the saddle, which was the first thing Alice noticed, and he wore a brown hat pushed back from his forehead at an angle that suggested he had pushed it back habitually while thinking, and he had a face that was weathered without being old, serious without being grim. She put him at perhaps 27 or 28, though the sun did things to a person's face out here that made ages difficult to calculate. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from Clover and swung down with the fluid ease of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot, and he took his hat off as he approached her, which she noticed because not every man out here remembered that particular courtesy. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was low and even the kind of voice that did not waste effort on volume. "Looks like your mare's having a hard time of it." "Fetlock," Alice said. She stepped wrong in the rocks back through the creek bed. "It is not broken, but I cannot ride her." He nodded and crouched down beside Clover without asking permission, running his hands along the leg in the same gentle, careful way Alice had, and Clover, who was suspicious of strangers under the best of circumstances, lowered her head and tolerated it. That told Alice something about the man before he said another word. "You have far to go?" he asked, looking up at her. 12 miles, she said. "Into Harlan Creek. My father is ill and I have a letter from my sister." He looked at the letter she was still holding, though she had not realized she'd taken it out again, and then he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him stand up slowly and settle his hat back on his head and look out at the flat country between them and the town. "I am Tobias Collier," he said. "I have been working the Hartley Ranch east of Harlan Creek for the past 2 years. I know this country well enough." "Alice Ralston," she said. "My family has a place 3 miles north of town. Or we did. My father has not been well." Tobias Collier looked at Clover and then at his own horse, a big dark roan gelding with a white star on his forehead, and then at Alice Ralston with her dusty traveling coat and her letter and her 12 miles to go. "Take Remai," he said. Alice blinked. "I beg your pardon. My horse. His name is Remai. He is steady and he will not give you trouble." Tobias said it simply, as though he were offering to share the last piece of bread at a table, something natural and obvious and not requiring extensive deliberation. "And you?" Alice said. "I will walk." She stared at him. "It is 12 miles. "I have walked further," he said, and there was no boastfulness in it, just the flat matter-of-fact statement of someone reporting a historical fact. "Mr. Collier," she said carefully, "I cannot take a man's horse and leave him on the flats." "You can," he said, "because the alternative is you leading your mare 12 miles in the afternoon heat, which will take until well after dark, or you staying here until someone else comes along, which might be tomorrow morning, or you leaving your mare alone, which I suspect you would not do." He paused. "Your father is ill. You have a letter. Every hour counts." Alice looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing in his expression that suggested he was performing heroism or expecting gratitude of a particular kind. He simply appeared to have assessed the problem and arrived at the most logical solution and was waiting for her to agree with his reasoning. "I will return him," she said. "Tomorrow or the day after. I will ride him out to the Hartley Ranch myself." "I know you will," Tobias said. And again it was simply a statement of fact, as though her character were already established and he was merely confirming what he knew. He helped her move the saddlebags from Clover's back to Remai's, and he secured them with the quick competence of someone who had packed and unpacked 1,000 times. He checked Remai's cinch and adjusted it slightly for her height, because she was not as tall as he was and the stirrups wanted changing. He held the roan steady while she mounted, and Remai turned his head back to look at her with one large, calm eye and then faced forward again, apparently satisfied. "Stay on the main trail," Tobias told her. "There is a fork about 4 miles on that goes toward the Jessup grazing land. Stay left. You will see the water tower at Harlan Creek from the top of the rise about 2 miles out." "I know the fork," she said. She had lived in this country most of her life, after all, but she did not say it sharply because he was not being condescending. He was simply making sure. "Right then," he said, and stepped back. She gathered the reins and looked down at him, this stranger with his hat pushed back and his horse given away, and she felt something move through her that was more than gratitude and less than anything she had a name for yet. "Tobias Collier," she said, "you are either the most generous man in Kansas or the most foolish." "Could be both," he said, and for the first time the corner of his mouth curved upward, the smallest possible beginning of a smile, there and gone in an instant. She turned Remai toward Harlan Creek and pressed her heels gently to his sides, and the big roan moved out at a smooth, ground-eating walk, and Alice did not look back, though she wanted to, because she was not the kind of woman who looked back when there was something urgent ahead. But she thought about Tobias Collier the whole 12 miles, walking along behind her somewhere in the dust and the afternoon heat, alone on the Cimarron Flats, and the thought of it sat in the middle of her chest like a warm coal. Harlan Creek in the year 1878 was not a large town by any measure that would have satisfied a person raised in the eastern states. It had one main street with a general store, a post and telegraph office, a land office that doubled as the county recorder's, a saloon called the Dusty Pitcher that was somewhat less disreputable than its name suggested, a church of the Methodist persuasion, a livery stable run by a man named Orville Beggs who charged fair prices, and remembered every horse that ever came through his doors, and perhaps 200 souls spread across the town proper and the surrounding farms and ranches. Alice rode Remai straight to her father's house on the north edge of town, where the picket fence her father had painted white every spring for 20 years was now peeling for the second consecutive spring, because William Ralston had not been strong enough to hold a paintbrush since the previous autumn. Her sister Margaret met her at the door before she even reached the porch, and the look on Margaret's face told Alice everything she needed to know before either of them said a word. "He is still with us," Margaret said quickly, seeing Alice's expression. "He is still here, Alice, but it is not good." Alice tied Remai to the porch rail and went inside. Their father lay in the bedroom at the back of the house, in the same bed where he had slept for 20 years, and he looked smaller than Alice remembered from her last visit 3 months ago, smaller in the way that illness makes people smaller by taking something interior away from them. But his eyes were clear when they opened and found her, and his hand was warm when she took it. "Alice, girl," he said, and his voice was rough but steady. "I am here, Papa," she said. "That was faster than I expected," he said. "I had help with the traveling," she said, and she would explain about Clover and Tobias Collier later, when her father was rested and she had gathered herself. She sat with him for an hour, and then Margaret brought her food she could not quite eat and coffee she drank gratefully, and they talked in low voices in the kitchen about their father's condition, which the doctor from Dodge City had diagnosed as a weakness of the heart that would not improve and might, with any significant strain or upset, worsen quickly. He needed rest and calm and someone to manage the household, and Margaret had been doing that alone for 3 months, and Margaret had 2 children of her own under the age of 6 and a husband, Frank Delaney, who was a good man but whose own ranch demanded most of his time. "I will stay," Alice said. "Alice, your job in Meade." "I will write to Mrs. Drummond and explain," Alice said. "She will understand. I have been keeping her household accounts for 2 years and I have left everything in order." She said it with more confidence than she felt, because the Drummond household paid her $8 a month in room and board, which was more than she could earn in Harlan Creek, but she could not leave her father with Margaret to manage alone, and she would find a way to make it work. That was the kind of calculus Alice Ralston had been performing her whole life, the arithmetic of necessity against desire, and she was very practiced at it. She slept that night in her old room, in the narrow bed she had shared with Margaret as girls, and she lay awake longer than she expected thinking about a roan horse named Remai hitched to her porch rail, and a man walking 12 miles through the Kansas afternoon, and the exact quality of the small smile that had appeared briefly in the corner of Tobias Collier's mouth when he called himself both generous and foolish. In the morning, she woke early and fed Remai from the small supply of oats her father kept in the shed, and she brushed him down carefully, and he was a good horse, just as his owner had promised, calm and responsive and with kind eyes. She left him watered and comfortable while she cooked breakfast for her father and Margaret and Frank's children, 2 boys named Samuel and Owen who were 4 and 2 respectively, and who treated the kitchen as a territory to be conquered. After breakfast, she went to the livery stable and spoke with Orville Beggs about Clover. He sent one of his boys out to the Cimarron Flats with a spare halter and instructions, and Clover arrived at the stable by midday, walking more easily than Alice had feared, and Orville examined the leg and confirmed that with 2 weeks of rest and careful management, the mare would be sound again. He agreed to board her for a reduced rate because he had known the Ralston family for 15 years. That afternoon, Alice mounted Remai and rode east toward the Hartley Ranch. She had not been out to the Hartley place in some years, not since old James Hartley had been alive, and had occasionally traded for eggs and butter with her mother, who had been gone herself for 6 years now. The ranch was 5 miles east of town, a respectable operation with good water and a solid house that Hartley's son had expanded when he took it over. She could see the windmill turning before she could see the buildings. She asked at the house for Tobias Collier, and the ranch foreman, a compact and practical man named Hayes, pointed her toward the south pasture fence line where Tobias was working a section of downed wire. She rode out and found him crouched over a fence post with a pair of pliers and a particular expression of concentration that shifted when he heard hoofbeats and he looked up. He looked at Ramai and then at her, and he stood slowly. "You made it," he said. "I told you I would return him," she said. "I did not doubt it." She swung down from the saddle and led Ramai the last few steps to where Tobias stood, and she held the reins out to him. He took them, and their hands did not quite touch, but the leather of the reins passed between them in a way that felt, to Alice, like the most significant exchange she had made in a long time. "How is your father?" Tobias asked. She was briefly startled that he remembered. "He is comfortable," she said. "The doctor says he must rest. I am going to stay in Harlan Creek and help manage things." Tobias nodded. He stroked Ramai's neck with the easy familiarity of a man greeting an old friend. "And your mare? She will be sound in 2 weeks, Orville Beggs says. I owe you a debt, Mr. Collier. You walked 12 miles. "I did," he agreed. "Were you very miserable?" He considered this seriously. "My boots are not built for 12 miles of flat walking," he admitted. "The last 3 miles were somewhat unpleasant." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, coming out fuller and more genuine than she had intended, and it seemed to surprise him too because he looked at her with a particular attention, the way a person looks at something they did not expect to find interesting and have discovered they are. "I would like to repay you properly," she said, recovering her composure. "My sister makes a very good supper. If you are able to come to town this week, I would like to offer you a meal at minimum." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in that careful, unhurried way. "I will be in town Saturday," he said. "I go in most Saturdays for supplies." "Saturday then," she said. "The Ralston house is the white fence on the north end, though the paint is peeling this year." "I will find it," he said. She mounted up on Clover, who had been brought by one of Orville's boys earlier that morning because Alice had asked him to, and she rode back toward town, and this time she did look back just once, when she reached the top of a small rise, and Tobias Collier was still standing by the fence line with Ramai's reins in his hand, watching her go. She turned forward again and rode on, but the warm cold in her chest had not diminished any. If anything, it had grown somewhat warmer. Saturday came in the way that days came on the frontier, with more work in it than the preceding days, not less, because Saturday was when Alice drove the wagon to the general store for the household supplies her father needed, and helped Margaret with the washing, and sat with her father through the afternoon while he dozed and woke and dozed again. She cooked a chicken that Frank Delaney had brought from his place, stewing it slowly with onions and dried herbs from her mother's garden that still grew at the side of the house in a kind of botanical stubbornness. And she made biscuits and a dried apple cake. And she told Margaret that she had invited a man to supper, and Margaret's eyebrows rose in a way that Alice chose not to address. Tobias arrived at 5:30, which was precisely when she had suggested, and he had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hat brushed, his shirt clean, his boots polished to a degree that suggested either vanity or respect, and she decided it was the latter. He carried a small bundle of early wildflowers that he held out to her at the door, with the slightly awkward formality of a man who does not often bring flowers to women's doors, and was not entirely certain of the protocol. "These were growing along the East Road," he said. "They seemed appropriate." She took them and looked at them for a moment, yellow and purple and small, the modest flowers of the Kansas spring, and they were more appropriate than he probably knew because her mother had loved wildflowers specifically, had always said that something had to work harder to be beautiful when it had nothing tending it, and that the working harder showed. "Come in," she said. She introduced him to Margaret, who was perfectly polite, and also looked at Alice over Tobias's shoulder, with an expression that communicated a great deal in a very small amount of facial motion. She introduced him to Samuel and Owen, who were immediately interested in his hat and his spurs, and Owen attempted to take possession of one spur within about 30 seconds of introduction. Tobias handled this with a patience that Alice noted carefully. Her father was awake that evening and had insisted on being helped to the table, because William Ralston was not a man who received visitors from his bed if he could help it. He sat at the head of the table looking diminished but dignified, and he looked at Tobias Collier with the direct, measuring gaze of a man who has spent his life on the frontier and has learned to read people quickly, because on the frontier you cannot afford slow reading. "Collier," he said, "you gave my daughter your horse." "Yes, sir," Tobias said. "And you walked 12 miles." "Yes, sir." William Ralston was quiet for a moment. "My daughter does not need saving," he said. "She is a capable woman who has managed most of the difficulties this country has put in front of her without a great deal of assistance." "I could see that," Tobias said. "It was her horse that needed saving, not her." Though the time saved was for her sake. William Ralston looked at him a moment longer, and then he nodded, just once, a small nod that Alice recognized as his highest available expression of approval, and he said nothing more about it. Supper was easy in a way that surprised Alice. She had expected the particular stiffness that sometimes settled over a table when a stranger was present, that careful performance of normalcy that was somehow more exhausting than being genuinely uncertain. But Tobias ate Margaret's food with sincere appreciation, and said so without being excessive about it. And he talked to her father about the state of the cattle ranges, and the question of whether the railroad expansion would come through the southern part of the territory, and what that would mean for the small ranchers. And he talked to Samuel about horses with complete seriousness, as though Samuel's opinions on the subject were worth considering, which Samuel clearly found enormously gratifying. After supper, William was tired and went back to bed, and Margaret took the boys upstairs, and Frank sat on the porch smoking his pipe, and Alice and Tobias washed up the dishes together, which was not anything she had planned or suggested, but which simply happened because she began washing and he picked up the drying cloth without being asked. "You have been out here long?" she asked, meaning Kansas, meaning the territory. 7 years, he said. "I came out from Tennessee when I was 20. My family had a farm there, but there were 6 of us and the land was tired." He paused, turning a plate in the cloth. "I meant to save enough to buy my own land out here. I am closer to that than I was." "How close?" she asked, and then immediately felt the question was too forward, but he answered it without any sign of taking it as an intrusion. "I have enough for a down payment on a small spread if the right piece comes available. There is a section north of the creek that Hartley does not use. I have spoken to the land office about it." "The Beckett section," she said immediately, because she knew that land. She had known that land since childhood. "It has good water and the soil is deeper than it looks. My father always said someone with patience could grow winter wheat there." Tobias looked at her with a new interest. "That is exactly what I thought," he said. They stood there for a moment with the washed dishes and the warm kitchen air around them, and Alice was aware that they had moved very quickly from strangers to something that felt like a different category, something she did not have a precise word for, the way certain conversations move forward on their own momentum regardless of what you intended. "I should go," he said. "It is getting dark." "Yes," she said. He went out and saddled Remai from the rail, and she stood on the porch in the cooling evening, and he mounted up and looked down at her. "I will be in town again next Saturday," he said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was something offered and waiting to be accepted. "I will be here," she said, which was not quite an invitation and not quite a mere acknowledgement. It was something in between, something that both of them understood in the particular way that people understand things that are not yet fully spoken but are fully meant. He rode away into the blue dusk, and Alice stayed on the porch until she could no longer hear the hoofbeats, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the wildflowers in a jar of water and looked at them for a long time. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown. "Alice," she said. "Do not say anything," Alice said. I was only going to say that he has very kind eyes, Margaret said. Alice looked at the flowers. Yes, she said, he does. The weeks that followed were organized by necessity and shaped by something else that Alice was not quite ready to name. Her father required steady attention, the kind of routine that a sick person needs to feel anchored. He needed his medicine at regular intervals, the digitalis that the Dodge City doctor had prescribed, and he needed his meals at consistent times, and he needed company in the afternoons when the tedium of rest became its own kind of suffering. Alice provided all of this with a thoroughness that surprised even Margaret, who had assumed their roles would be reversed, who had thought Alice too restless for the long patience of caregiving. But Alice was not as restless as Margaret had always believed. She was merely purposeful, and caregiving gave her purpose as surely as anything else she had done. She also took on the household accounts for the Ralston family's small affairs, such as they were, and she wrote to Mrs. Drummond in Mead to explain her situation. And Mrs. Drummond wrote back with genuine sympathy, and the information that she had found a girl from Dodge City to keep the accounts, and she hoped Alice's father would improve, and she would always have a place if Alice needed it. That letter sat in Alice's dresser drawer, an open door she was not certain she would ever use. Tobias Collier came into town every Saturday, as he had promised, and every Saturday he stopped at the Ralston house. He never stayed long enough to be an imposition, always brought something small, a bag of coffee beans 1 week, a wrapped piece of cheese from the dairy farm east of Hartley's another week, once a book he had finished reading that he thought she might enjoy, a battered copy of a George Eliot novel that had been passed through enough hands that the cover was soft as cloth. "You read novels?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "Is that remarkable?" he said. "Most of the men out here read seed catalogs and the almanac," she said. "I read those too," he said. "But a man needs more than weather predictions and planting schedules for the winter evenings." She read the novel in 2 weeks and felt George Eliot speaking to her in ways that were uncomfortably pointed about women and duty and the small heroisms of ordinary life. And when Tobias asked her what she thought of it, she told him the truth, all of it, the parts that moved her and the parts she disagreed with. And he listened to all of it with his full attention, and then offered his own reading of it, which was different from hers in some ways and similar in others. And the conversation lasted 2 hours, and her father fell asleep in his chair listening to it, and Margaret declared them both exhausting in a voice that made it clear she meant the opposite. There was a Sunday in May when the weather was fine, and Alice's father was having a good day, energetic enough to sit on the porch in the afternoon sun, and Tobias came by in the late morning, because he had helped the Methodist minister repair a section of the church roof, and the minister's house was only 4 blocks from the Ralston place. He stayed through the afternoon almost without either of them deciding that he would, the hours passing in that way that hours do when the company is right, sliding forward without friction. He and her father played chess on the porch while Alice read in the chair beside them, and her father beat Tobias twice in a row and was clearly delighted, and Tobias took his defeats with good humor and demanded a third game and lost that one too, which made William Ralston laugh, a genuine, full laugh that Alice had not heard in months. "You let him win," she said to Tobias later, when her father had gone inside for his evening medicine. "The first game, perhaps," Tobias admitted. "But your father is an excellent chess player. The other 2 he earned." She believed him and was glad for it, not for her father being flattered, but for her father being genuinely good at something that made him happy. They walked to the edge of the property together in the late afternoon, to the back fence where her mother's kitchen garden grew with its herbal stubbornness, and she showed him what grew there, naming each plant with the knowledge she had been given as a girl, thyme and sage and lavender and a sprawling rosemary that had survived 3 hard winters and showed no signs of surrendering. "Your mother planted all this?" he asked. "She did, and I have kept it going since she passed." Alice touched the rosemary gently. "She used to say that a garden is an argument against pessimism. "That is a good argument," he said. They stood in the garden in the long prairie light, the late afternoon turning the world gold, and Alice became aware that they were standing very close together, closer than they had been inside the house, closer than the width of a table between them. She could smell the clean outdoor smell of him, wool and horses and the plain soap he used, and she was aware of the warmth coming off him in the cooling air. "Alice," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way anyone else said it. It was careful and certain at the same time, the way you say something you have been thinking about for long enough that you know it by heart. She turned to look at him. "I think you know what I am going to say," he said. "I think I might," she said. "And what do you think?" he asked. She considered him for a moment, this tall, thoughtful, patient man who had given her his horse and walked 12 miles and brought her wild flowers and read George Eliot, and let her father beat him at chess, and listened to her talk about novels and gardens with the same complete attention he gave to everything. "I think," she said slowly, "that when you walked those 12 miles, you gave me more than a horse." He was quiet, watching her. "You gave me the idea that there were still men in this country who acted on principle rather than advantage," she said. "I had been somewhat pessimistic on that point." "And now," he said, "now I am somewhat less pessimistic," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she was beginning to know very well. "I would not want to be responsible for your optimism," he said. "That sounds like a great deal of pressure," she laughed. And then he was smiling, fully this time, the real smile she had been wondering about since the first day, and it changed his whole face, opened it up into something warm and a little bit startling, and she thought that she had been quite right to wonder about it because it was worth the wondering. He did not kiss her that afternoon. He was not a man who rushed things, which she had understood about him from the first. But he took her hand, there in her mother's garden, and held it for a few moments in both of his. And that was its own kind of declaration, quiet and certain, and Alice Ralston, who had been managing on her own for most of her adult life, and had not particularly expected to find someone whose company made managing feel less solitary, stood in the late afternoon gold and let herself be glad about it. June arrived with its particular Kansas intensity, the heat settling in with a flat determination that pressed down on everything. Alice had established a routine that worked: the morning hours with her father, the midday for the household, the late afternoon for herself, which she spent mostly reading or writing in the small journal she kept, or occasionally walking into town to talk to people she had known since childhood, to Mrs. Pettigrew at the general store, and to Reverend Aldridge's wife Clara, who was the closest thing Harlan Creek had to a newspaper in that she knew everything and was thoughtful about what she shared. Clara Aldridge was the one who told Alice, one June afternoon over tea at the parsonage, about the situation with the Beckett land. "There is a man from Wichita who is making inquiries," Clara said, in the careful way she delivered information she thought the recipient needed but might not welcome. "A land speculator, I believe. He has been to the land office twice." Alice set down her teacup. "The Beckett section, the one north of the creek." "That very one," Clara said. "I thought you might want to know." Alice rode out to the Hartley Ranch that same afternoon and found Tobias in the horse barn rather than the pasture, working on a piece of harness with the focused attention he gave to everything mechanical. He looked up when she came in, and whatever she had on her face made him put the harness down immediately. She told him about the speculator from Wichita. He was quiet for a long moment. "I have most of the money," he said. "Not all of it. I was going to approach the land office at the end of summer when I had the full amount." "How short are you?" she asked. He named a figure. It was not a catastrophic shortfall, but it was significant enough that end of summer might be too late if the Wichita man was moving. "I have some savings," Alice said. He looked at her quickly. "I have been keeping household accounts for 2 years and I have not spent everything I earned," she said. "It is not a great deal, but it is something." "Alice," he said, and there was something complicated in his voice. "I am not suggesting anything improper," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I am suggesting a business arrangement, a loan. You can pay me back when the first harvest comes in." She paused. "Though I should tell you that if you are going to grow winter wheat on the Beckett section, you will need to talk to my father about the soil preparation. He knows that land better than anyone." Tobias looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light came through the open barn door and lay in bars across the hay-covered floor between them, and the horses shifted and breathed in their stalls around them. "You are a remarkable woman," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "Which is not the same thing, though people often confuse them." "I do not confuse them," he said. "You are both." She felt the color rise in her face, which annoyed her faintly because she was not a person who blushed easily. "Will you go to the land office?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "First thing." He went to the land office the next morning, and he filed on the Beckett section, before the Wichita man had gotten himself properly organized. And the land was his. 60 acres with good water rights and deeper soil than it looked, just as Alice had said. He came to the Ralston house that evening to tell her, and she made coffee and they sat on the porch in the cooling evening, and he described the parcel to her with a precision and a quiet joy that she had not heard from him before, the way a person describes something they have wanted for a long time and can now almost touch. "You will need to break the north section first," she said. "The ground there is still virgin sod. It is hard work." "I know it," he said. "And you will need a better plow than the one Hartley uses for the home field." "I have already written to the implement dealer in Dodge City," he said. She smiled. "You have been planning this carefully." "For 2 years," he said. He looked at her across the porch in the blue evening, and the words that followed were careful and deliberate, the way all his important words were. "I had been thinking of it as something I was doing alone," he said. "But lately that picture has been changing." The porch was quiet except for the sound of the prairie night beginning, the crickets starting up in the grass and the distant coyote somewhere to the west and the soft sounds of the town settling into evening. "Tobias," she said. "I know it is soon," he said. "By some people's reckoning. I know you have your father to think about and your sister and the situation here. I am not asking you to decide anything tonight." "What are you asking?" she said. "I am asking if the picture I have been changing in my mind, the one that includes you, is something you would like to be in," he said. "Genuinely in, not as an arrangement or a convenience, but because you want to be there." The honesty of it was so complete and so unadorned that Alice felt it the way you feel a sudden change in wind direction, the whole atmosphere shifting around a simple fact. "I have been in that picture for a while," she said quietly. "I was waiting to see if you would show it to me." They sat together on the porch of the peeling white fence house in the Kansas June evening, and after a while, his hand found hers on the armrest between the chairs, and they sat like that while the stars came out one by one over the flat country, and it was one of those moments that Alice would return to in memory for years, not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because it was the moment she knew, with the certainty she reserved for things that were true, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. July brought a different kind of heat, the kind that baked the clay and shimmered off the limestone, and made even the pragmatic people of Harlan Creek move more slowly. Alice's father had a difficult stretch in the second week, a night when his breathing became labored, and she sat up with him until near dawn, holding his hand and talking to him in a low voice about anything she could think of, about the garden and her mother and the old place in Missouri they had come from when Alice was 4, which she barely remembered but which her father could describe in complete detail, every fence post and apple tree. He came through the night and was better by morning, but it frightened Alice in a way that she had been trying to hold off, the knowledge that better was not the same as well, and that her father's time was finite in a way that she could see now, could almost measure. She told Tobias about it the next Saturday, and he listened without offering false comfort, which was one of the things she valued most about him. He did not tell her everything would be fine. He told her that she was doing the right thing being there, and that her father knew she was there, and that knowing mattered more than most people understood. "My mother died when I was 14, he said. "She was sick for 2 years. I sat with her a great deal. I know what it is. She had not known that. He did not offer personal history freely, not because he was secretive, but because he was not a man who made his sorrows into conversation pieces. She felt the weight of what he had shared. I am sorry, she said. She knew I was there, he said. That is the thing I hold on to. In the third week of July, Tobias left the Hartley ranch. It was amicable, his and Hartley's parting. He had given 2 months' notice as was proper, and Hartley had relied on him long enough to be genuinely sorry to lose him. But Tobias had his own land now and his own obligations to it, and there was no version of the future in which he continued working another man's ranch when his own soil was waiting to be broken. He moved into the small cabin that stood at the southeast corner of the Beckett section, a one-room structure that the previous owner had used for storage, and that required significant improvement. And he spent the first 2 weeks doing those improvements with the systematic efficiency he brought to everything physical, re-roofing it and rethinking the chimney, and putting in a proper floor, and building a second room onto the back that was still rough but would serve. Alice went out with Margaret one Sunday to see the place. Frank drove them in the wagon, because it was still 4 miles east of town and the road was not quite a road yet, more a suggestion of regular travel. They brought food, a cold roast chicken and bread and a jar of sweet pickles and a jar of her mother's preserved peaches, which Alice had been hoarding for an occasion. Tobias met them at the cabin, and he was plainly pleased they had come, though he was honest about the state of the place, which was rough but clean and had good bones. Margaret walked around it with the practiced eye of a woman who has maintained a household on the frontier, and she pointed out several practical improvements that Tobias accepted without defensiveness, and wrote down on the back of an envelope he pulled from his pocket. Frank went out with Tobias to look at the land, and the two of them spent an hour walking the north section together while Alice and Margaret spread a cloth on the flat ground outside and arranged the food. "He is a good man," Margaret said, with the directness she always used when she had decided something. "I know it," Alice said. "Papa likes him." "I know that too." "And you?" Margaret said in the tone of voice that meant she already knew the answer and wanted Alice to say it out loud. Alice looked at the north pasture where 2 figures were walking the land, Tobias's tall shape and Frank's shorter one, and she thought about the Beckett section and the second room on the back of the cabin, and the envelope in his pocket where he had written down what Margaret said, and she thought about wildflowers held out at a door with the awkward formality of a man who did not often bring flowers to women's doors. "I love him," she said. It was the first time she had said it in those words, to anyone including herself, and it felt like the kind of statement that, once made, rearranged the furniture of everything else. Margaret made no expression of surprise because Margaret had known for weeks. She simply nodded and handed Alice a piece of bread. August was the month when everything ripened and everything was decided. Tobias had broken 15 acres of the north section by himself, working from first light until dark, and Alice had ridden out 3 times a week to bring him proper meals, because she had learned in July that left to himself, he would work through dinner on a piece of hardtack and dried meat and call it sufficient, which it was not. On the Wednesday of the second week of August, she arrived at the cabin with a basket and found him sitting on the new front step he had built, still and quiet in a way that was different from his usual thinking stillness. He had a letter in his hand. She sat beside him on the step without asking. "My brother in Tennessee," he said. "He writes that the farm is failing. He is asking if there is work out here." "Is there?" she said. "There is work enough for 2 men on this land," he said. "More than enough. I could use the help, especially through the first year." He paused. "But the cabin is 1 room and a rough extension. It is not suited for 2 households." Alice looked at the rough extension. Then she looked at the north section of land stretching out in the August sun, and she thought about the soil her father had always said was deeper than it looked, and she thought about the garden at the Ralston house and the wildflowers in a jar of water and the chess games on the porch, and a man who had given her his horse and walked 12 miles without being asked. You could add a third room onto the south side, she said. There is room for it, and the lumber would not cost more than you can manage with the first cutting. She paused. If your brother comes, he would need some time to establish himself. A year or two. Yes, Tobias said. And in that year or two, she said carefully, the arrangements here would presumably have changed from their current form. Tobias turned to look at her. The August light was full on his face, on the planes of it she had come to know and the eyes she trusted, and he was very still in the particular way he was still when something mattered very much. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" he said. "I am suggesting," she said, "that two people and a brother and eventually a larger household would justify a more substantial set of rooms and arrangements than a man alone would require. I am suggesting it with a certain amount of implication attached." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Alice Ralston, I have been trying to find the right time to ask you properly, with some ceremony. I thought about waiting until the first harvest when I had something solid to offer you." "The land is solid," she said. "The cabin is solid, or it will be. You are solid, that is enough." He took her hand there on the front step of the rough cabin on the Beckett section, and he looked at her with the full weight of his attention, all of it, nothing held back. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said, simply and without hesitation, because she had decided it weeks ago and had only been waiting for the question to arrive. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, and then he looked at her again with that smile, the real one, fully open, and she thought she would never grow tired of looking at it, not in any number of years. They were married on the second Saturday of September, in the Methodist church where Tobias had helped repair the roof, and Reverend Aldridge officiated with the kind of warm particularity that suggested he had been paying attention to both of them for some months and approved of what he had observed. Alice wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her because she was an inch taller, and the fashions of 20 years ago wanted some adjustment for a woman of the 1870s anyway, and it was deep blue wool, not white, because her mother had been a practical woman who believed in things you could wear again. Her father came to the wedding in the church wheelchair that the Reverend kept for elderly parishioners, pushed by Frank Delaney, and he looked fragile but present and entirely himself, and he took Tobias's hand at the front of the church before the service and said something to him quietly that Alice could not hear, and Tobias nodded twice with the gravity of a man receiving something precious. She asked him later what her father had said. "He said she will argue with you about the best way to do almost everything," Tobias told her with the smile she loved. "He said he is usually right." "He is usually right," Alice agreed. "He said the arguing was the best part," Tobias said. Margaret wept throughout the ceremony in the way that Margaret wept, with efficiency and no self-consciousness. And Samuel, who was 5 now, stood in the front pew with the serious expression of a child who has been told this is an important occasion and is doing his best to honor that importance. And Owen fell asleep on the pew cushion during the vows, and no one woke him. They had a small reception in the church hall, food brought by half the town because that was how things were done out here. And there was fiddle music from old Pete Cavanaugh, who played at every occasion within 20 miles regardless of whether he was invited. And Alice danced with her father in his wheelchair, just her feet moving and his hands in hers and his eyes, full of something she recognized as the fullness of a man who has seen his daughter get what she deserved and is grateful to the world for delivering it. The day after the wedding, they drove out to the cabin together in Tobias's wagon, and Alice looked at the rough-timbered place with the new south wing half-framed, and the kitchen window that looked out over the north pasture toward the creek, and she thought about her mother's argument against pessimism, and she thought about 60 acres of deep-soiled Kansas land waiting for winter wheat, and she thought about a man walking 12 miles alone across the Cimarron Flats because a woman he had not yet met needed his horse more than he did. "We will need curtains on that kitchen window," she said. "We will," he said. "And the garden will go on the east side where the morning light is." "Good morning light on the east side," he agreed. She stepped down from the wagon and walked to the cabin door and opened it, and the morning air came in through the kitchen window across the bare floor, and she stood there in the middle of her new life, and it felt, against all her practiced management of expectations, exactly like enough. September settled into October and October into November, and the cabin on the Beckett section grew warmer and better furnished and more itself with each passing week. Alice brought things from the Ralston house as her father's situation required her to be there less constantly, Margaret taking on more of the daily management, as William Ralston's condition stabilized into something chronic and careful but not immediately critical. Alice drove into town 3 times a week to sit with her father, and Tobias came with her on Sundays, and the chess games on the porch continued until the weather turned too cold, at which point they moved to the parlor. Tobias's brother Nathan arrived on the 1st of November, on the afternoon stage from Dodge City, a younger version of Tobias with the same height and the same quiet manner but with a rawer quality about him, an unfinished quality that the territory had not yet had time to shape. He was 22, 2 years younger than Alice, and he stood in the yard of the cabin with his single bag, and looked at the flat country in all directions and said, "Well," in a tone that contained an entire autobiography. "It gets better," Tobias told him. "Does it look better?" Nathan asked. "No," Tobias said honestly, "but it feels better." Nathan slept in the south wing, which was now closed and floored and decent, and he proved himself within a week to be a hard worker of the unassuming variety, the kind who simply showed up in the morning and started doing what needed doing without requiring supervision or praise. Alice fed him at their table and thought that whatever had shaped Tobias Collier's character had clearly had access to both brothers, whatever combination of their mother and the Tennessee farm, and the particular way the Collier family apparently believed in showing up and doing the work without making much noise about it. November brought a hard frost, and with it the news from Alice's father that he had put the Ralston house and its land into her and Margaret's names jointly, and that he had done it with a lawyer from Dodge City and a clear head, and wanted her to know while he could tell her himself. Alice sat with him that afternoon, long enough to say everything she wanted to say, which was considerably more than she managed in the actual words, but her father had always been good at hearing what she meant rather than just what she said. "You picked a good man," he told her. "He picked me first," she said. "Smart man," her father said and closed his eyes. William Ralston died on the 14th of December, quietly and without drama, in the early morning while the sky outside was still dark and the first snow of the season was falling in the soft, almost silent way of the first snowfall, as though the weather understood the occasion. Alice and Margaret were both there, and he passed holding one hand from each of them, which was exactly what he would have wanted, and he looked entirely at peace in a way that, even in the middle of her grief, Alice was grateful for. They buried him in the Harlan Creek churchyard next to their mother, on a cold December day with a sky the color of pewter, and every person in the county who had known William Ralston standing in the cold to say so. It was a considerable number of people, which said something about who he had been. Alice grieved with the full grief of someone who does not manage their grief, but goes through it, who takes it seriously because anything else would be a dishonesty about what was lost. Tobias stayed close without hovering, was present without demanding anything from her presence, and at night in the cabin he held her while she sometimes cried and sometimes simply breathed, and sometimes told him stories about her father, which was what she needed most, the telling of the stories while there was still someone who had not heard them all yet. "He came out here from Missouri in 1854, she told Tobias one night. "My mother was 8 months along with Margaret, and he came anyway, because the land was here and the opportunity was here, and he was too stubborn to let opportunity wait for convenient timing. He built the first version of that house himself in 2 weeks before winter. Margaret was born in it. He sounds like a man who got things done," Tobias said. "He did," she said. He was also a man who sat in his garden every evening in summer and watched the light change, and he never explained why to anyone, but I think he was just grateful for it, for the light, for being there to see it. "That is not a small thing," Tobias said. "No," she said, "it is not." December moved into January, and January was the hardest month on the Kansas plains. The wind coming down from the north without anything in its way, and the cold settling into the bones of buildings and people alike. But the cabin was solid, and there was sufficient wood laid in, and Tobias had made sure of both before December ended. In February, Alice realized she was going to have a baby. She realized it on a Tuesday morning while standing in the kitchen in the early light, and she stood very still for a moment with the certainty of it settling over her. And then she sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat on the table's surface and breathed carefully and thought about it. She told Tobias that evening. He was sitting by the fire with a piece of harness he was mending, the way he often spent winter evenings, some practical task for his hands while his mind went wherever it went, and she sat across from him and said, "I think we are going to have a child in the autumn." He set the harness down. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him taking it in, the full measure of it, and then his face did something she had not quite seen it do before, something that came apart slightly at the controlled surface and showed what was underneath, which was a joy so complete and so surprised that it looked almost like being overwhelmed. "Alice," he said. "It would appear so," she said, and she was smiling in spite of herself. The kind of smile that happens before you decide to smile. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her with everything he had. No containment, no careful management, just the full, open look of a man who has been given something he did not dare to want too specifically in case it did not come. He kissed her in the way that he kissed her when he meant it most, which was the way he always kissed her but with more of everything. And she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating fast, faster than usual, and thought that she loved him more than she was generally in the habit of saying out loud, but that she should say it more. "I love you," she said, when they were done with the kissing. "I love you," he said, and it was the old statement between them, the established fact, but it had weight to it this evening that was particular and fresh. Nathan, told over breakfast the next morning, turned red in the face and said, "Well," in the same tone he had used in the yard the day he arrived, the tone that contained everything he was not quite managing to say. Then he shook Tobias's hand with a grip that suggested he was more moved than he was comfortable expressing, and he clapped him once on the shoulder and went outside to start the morning chores, which was the Collier brother version of an emotional demonstration. Margaret, told on Sunday, wept efficiently and then immediately began planning, which was the Ralston sister version of the same. Spring came to the Beckett section in the particular way it came to the Kansas plains, not gradually but in large, sudden gestures of green and warmth. The winter wheat coming up in the north section, with a thoroughness that made Tobias stand at the kitchen window and look at it in the mornings with a private satisfaction that Alice recognized as one of the things she loved most about him. The way he was satisfied by things he had built and grown, by things he had made real from an idea. The first planting season on their own land went well. The soil of the Beckett section was exactly what her father and she had both believed it to be, responsive to good management, willing to give back what was put into it. By June, the north section's winter wheat was ready for cutting, and Tobias and Nathan worked it together. And when it was done, Tobias wrote the figure of the first harvest in a small ledger he kept with a particularity that made Alice think of all the years of planning that had preceded it. He paid her back the loan she had made him, every dollar, and presented it to her with a seriousness that she almost argued with, because it felt unnecessary between them now. But she saw that it mattered to him, not as a transaction but as the completion of something, the closing of a promise he had made to himself. So she accepted it seriously and thanked him seriously, and that was that. Alice wrote to Mrs. Drummond in late March to say that she would not be returning to Mead, and she thanked her for the open door, and Mrs. Drummond wrote back a warm and generous reply that concluded with the observation that she had suspected as much from Alice's letters since the previous autumn and was very happy for her. The summer passed in the full, purposeful way of a first summer establishing yourself on your own land. There was always something to be done, always something next, and Alice found that she thrived in it, that the particular combination of managing a household and keeping a garden and being useful in tangible ways that showed their results daily was something she had been suited for without knowing it. She planted a kitchen garden on the east side of the cabin, exactly where she had said it would go, and she brought roots and cuttings from her mother's garden at the Ralston house, so that the thyme and sage and lavender and the indestructible rosemary came with her, in a botanical form of inheritance. She was large and healthy through the pregnancy, which the women of Harlan Creek assured her was the best possible sign, and she continued to do most of what she had always done, because she was not a person who permitted bodily inconvenience to alter her fundamental operations if she could help it, though she accepted Tobias's entirely earnest and unobtrusive help without argument, which Margaret said was the most remarkable change she had ever observed in her sister, and the clearest evidence of love she could imagine. The baby came on the 3rd of October, on a morning when the first autumn color was in the cottonwoods along the creek, a long and not entirely comfortable process attended by the local midwife, Mrs. Garfield, who was competent and calm, and by Margaret, who was efficient and slightly less calm, and by Tobias, who was in the front room working through what was presumably the most thorough cleaning of his rifle he had ever undertaken, because he needed something to do with his hands. It was a boy. A healthy, vocal, already opinionated boy who announced himself to the Kansas morning with considerable energy, and whom Alice held in her arms in the full light of the October day, and felt the final piece of something settle into its place. The particular piece she had not even known was missing until it was found. Tobias came into the bedroom when Mrs. Garfield called him, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Alice holding the baby, and the expression on his face was the same overwhelmed joy she had seen in February, but larger this time, large enough that it seemed to fill the room entirely. He came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and he looked at his son, and his son looked back at him with the unfocused but attentive gaze of a new person encountering the world for the first time, and Tobias put one large, careful hand against the baby's head and was very still. "Hello," he said in a low voice, "the way you speak to someone you have been waiting for." "His name," Alice said. She had been thinking about it for months, considering and discarding options with the thoroughness she brought to any important decision. "I thought William," she said. "If you agree." Tobias looked at her. "After your father," he said. "He was a good man," she said. "And he saw something in you on the first evening which I think proves his quality." Tobias nodded, looking back at the baby, at William Collier, who had closed his eyes now with the total confidence of someone who knows he is held safely. "William," Tobias said. "It suits him." Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow and gold in the October morning, and the winter wheat fields of the Beckett section lay turned and ready for the next planting, and Harlan Creek was 4 miles west, and the church where they had married was there, and the graves of her parents were there, and Margaret and Frank and Samuel and Owen were there. And somewhere out on the Cimarron Flats, the road ran between the limestone and the scrub grass, past the place where a bay mare had gone lame on a September afternoon 3 years ago, and a stranger had handed over his reins and walked away into the dust. Alice lay back against the pillows with her son and her husband beside her and the autumn light coming through the window, and she thought about what it meant, the chain of it, the way one act of simple, unasked-for generosity had set something in motion that arrived here, to this room, to this morning, to the weight of this child in her arms and the steadiness of this man beside her. She thought about a man walking 12 miles alone and what it must have been like, the long flat light and the sore boots, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing and would do it again regardless, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who did not require the right thing to be convenient before he did it. She thought about how she had looked back once from the top of the rise and he had been standing there with his horse's reins in his hand, watching her go. "Tobias," she said. He looked at her. "That day on the flats," she said, "when you gave me Ramai, why did you do it truly? You did not know me." He considered this with the same seriousness he gave every real question. "I knew enough," he said. "What did you know? I knew your mare was lame and you had 12 miles to go and something important waiting at the end of it," he said. "And I knew that a woman who stands alone in the middle of the Cimarron Flats and does not look frightened, only determined, is a woman who deserves whatever help is available." "That is a very simple answer," she said. "It was a very simple decision," he said. "At the time. And now," she said. He smiled, the full smile, the real one she had wondered about that first day. "Now it is the best decision I ever made," he said, "by a considerable distance." William Collier, 5 hours old and already in possession of considerable opinions about the world, shifted in Alice's arms and made a small sound of either displeasure or inquiry. It was difficult to tell yet which, and both his parents looked at him with the full attention of two people who have a great deal to learn about a specific new person and are entirely willing to do the learning. Nathan came to the cabin that evening with a jar of the honey he had been tending in a small hive he'd set up at the edge of the east garden, and he held his nephew with an awkward care that spoke to having no prior experience with infants but every intention of learning, and he looked at the baby and said, "Well," for the third time in his life in Alice's presence, with all the same weight as before. Margaret came the next day with her boys, and Samuel was solemn and serious about the baby in the way that 5-year-olds are solemn and serious when they understand that something important is happening even if they are uncertain of the specifics. And he asked Alice several extremely pointed questions about where exactly babies came from, which she deflected with the practiced ease of a woman who has managed household accounts and will not be thrown by an unexpected line of inquiry. The autumn deepened around the Beckett section, and they moved through it together, the work of the land and the work of the household and the work of this new, demanding, altogether extraordinary person who had come to live among them, and who turned out to have his father's eyes and his mother's determination, and an entirely original version of the Collier Ralston stubbornness that promised to be remarkable when fully developed. November, and the wheat in the ground again. December, and the first anniversary of William Ralston's death, which Alice marked by visiting the grave with Tobias and speaking to her father in her head in the way she did still. The ongoing conversation that did not require a living interlocutor, because she had enough of his voice inside her to supply both sides. January of 1880, and Nathan writing to a girl back in Tennessee, who had apparently been writing back with more warmth than the letters had started with, and Tobias reading his brother's face over supper and Alice reading it too, and both of them deciding independently not to say anything yet, but exchanging a look across the table that communicated the identical amusement. The Ralston house in town had been rented to a schoolteacher newly arrived from Ohio, a capable young woman named Miss Bauer who was teaching the Harlan Creek children with a rigor that the community found both bracing and effective, and the rental income went into the account that Margaret and Alice held jointly, a modest but steady addition to both household circumstances. February, and William learning to be interested in his own hands, discovering them with the absorption of a scientist making an important find. March, and Tobias riding into town for the land office to add 5 more acres on the south edge of the section that had come available when old Peterson moved his family to Colorado, and coming home in the long evening light with the deed folded in his shirt pocket, and the particular look of a man who is building something real and can see its edges growing. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the deed, and Alice was at the stove, and William was in the wooden cradle that Tobias had made in the winter evenings, one of the more beautiful things he had made, smooth-sided and solid with a runner that rocked easily. And the kitchen smelled of the soup she was making and the rosemary on the windowsill, her mother's rosemary, still going, still insisting on existing, still being an argument against pessimism. 5 more acres on the south, Tobias said. She turned from the stove. South has good drainage, she said. We could try spring wheat there, 2 crops. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her temple and looked over her shoulder at the soup. It smells remarkable, he said. It is your mother's recipe, she said. The one you dictated to me last winter. He was quiet for a moment. She would have liked you, he said. I believe I would have liked her, Alice said. Summer came again, the second summer on the Beckett section, and everything was better established. The garden fuller, the fields more practiced in their purpose. The cabin expanded once more with a proper room for William and a bigger kitchen. Because Alice had very clear ideas about kitchens and had communicated them to Tobias with the specificity that their partnership had always operated on. Each of them honest about what they needed, each of them interested in what the other needed. Nathan's girl from Tennessee came out on the summer stage in June, a practical dark-haired woman named Ruth who looked at the Kansas flatland with exactly the same expression Nathan had used on arrival, and then apparently decided, just as Nathan had, that she would get on with it. She and Alice recognized each other quickly, in the way that capable women recognize each other, and they became friends in the straightforward, unadorned way of people who do not have time for anything else and would not choose it anyway. Nathan and Ruth were married in September in the same Methodist church, by the same Reverend Aldridge, and this time Alice stood beside Margaret in the front pew and watched a Collier brother marry with the same quiet certainty she had observed in her own husband. And she thought about Tennessee and Missouri and Kansas, and how people carry their best qualities across any distance if those qualities are real. Tobias stood up for his brother and caught Alice's eye across the church at one point in the ceremony, and the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who share a history and a present and an anticipated future, and are, in this specific moment, together watching something good happen to someone they love. And the look said all of this without requiring words, because they had, by now, a language between them that did not always need words. Autumn of 1880, and William Collier beginning to pull himself upright against furniture with an expression of focused determination that was so thoroughly his mother's that it made Tobias laugh every time. He was walking by November, 14 months old and entirely committed to this new capability, covering the cabin floor at a determined pace and examining everything at knee height with his father's thorough attention. The Beckett section, now 65 acres, was becoming what they had imagined it could be. The winter wheat was established and reliable, and Tobias had added a small dairy operation, 2 cows who produced steadily and whose milk and butter supplemented their income through the months between harvests. Nathan farmed the south acres and helped with the larger tasks, and Ruth managed a second kitchen garden north of the cabin they were building at the south end of the property, a proper house now, larger than the original cabin, with room for a family. Ruth was expecting by spring, which she announced at Christmas dinner in the same practical tone she used for most important information, and Nathan's face did the same thing Tobias's face had done at the same news, which suggested that this particular response was Collier family genetics expressing itself with consistency. Alice looked at her husband across the Christmas table, in the lamplit warmth of the extended cabin kitchen. William in the high chair Tobias had built him making serious work of a piece of bread, and Margaret and Frank across the table, and Samuel now 7 years old and Owen 5, and both of them engaged in a conversation about something that seemed to involve horses and was apparently very funny, and Ruth beside Nathan with her news just told and Nathan still slightly stunned by joy. and Reverend Aldridge and Clara, who had come for Christmas dinner as they had come the year before because they were the kind of people who should always be invited. And Alice felt the fullness of it, the table and the warmth and the particular gravity of all this specific life accumulated around her. She looked at Tobias, and he was looking at her with the look that was only ever hers, the full, open, uncontained look. And she thought about a September afternoon in 1878, and a woman alone on the Cimarron Flats and a man who had assessed the situation and done the obvious thing without hesitation, and then walked 12 miles in boots not suited for walking. She thought about what a person gives away when they give away what they cannot afford to give, and what they get back in return, which is never what they expected and always more than they imagined. She thought about his voice saying it was a very simple decision at the time, and her thinking it was the best decision I ever made by a considerable distance, and the truth of both things existing side by side, the simplicity and the magnitude, the moment of ordinary generosity that had unfolded into all of this. William made a sound from his high chair that communicated either that he was done with the bread, or that he had a philosophical point to contribute to the table conversation, and Tobias reached over and straightened the boy's listening posture with one hand, and said something quietly in his ear that made William consider, appear to agree, and settle. Alice watched this small exchange, her husband and her son, the winter dark outside the windows and the lamplight inside, and she thought about her mother's argument against pessimism, which was a garden that kept growing, and about her father watching the light change every evening in summer, just grateful for it. And she thought that both of her parents had in their different ways been telling her the same thing, which was that a life of ordinary love, tended carefully, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the biggest thing available, more gravy. She said to Reverend Aldridge, because the gravy was there, and it would not keep, and there were 12 people at the table and Christmas dinner in 1880 in Harlan Creek. Kansas required at least some ordinary practical management alongside all the revelation. "Gladly," said Reverend Aldridge. And the lamp burned and the food was passed, and William reached for his father's sleeve and got it and held on. And outside the Kansas winter lay flat and cold and indifferent in all directions. But inside the cabin on the Beckett section, the warmth was entirely deliberate and hard-won and thoroughly sustained, the way the best warmth always is. The years moved forward with the particular pace of years that are full of purpose, quickly on the surface, and slowly when examined closely, each season containing more than could be easily catalogued, but adding up to something unmistakable. Tobias bought another 12 acres in the spring of 1882, bringing the section to 77 acres, and by then they had a proper barn and a second outbuilding, and the kitchen garden that Alice's mother had begun in spirit if not in soil, and a second child, a daughter this time, born in the summer of 1882 and named Eleanor, who arrived with all of William's energy and approximately twice his volume, and a set of opinions so strongly held that she appeared to arrive with them fully formed. Nathan and Ruth had settled into their house at the south end of the property with their own boy, Thomas, who was William's companion in arms, and shared his cousin's fascination with horses and general curiosity about everything at ground level. Alice kept the household accounts for both families, because she was very good at it, and because she found it satisfying in the way that things you are genuinely suited to are satisfying. And she also kept the accounts for Reverend Aldridge's church charitable fund, which had grown since Clara Aldridge had taken it in hand. And she helped Miss Bauer with the school funding applications, because Miss Bauer was extraordinary with children, and somewhat less extraordinary with paperwork, and Alice was the reverse. It was useful work, all of it, and it was hers, and she did it in the hours when William and Eleanor were settled, and Tobias was in the fields or the barn, in the kitchen with the rosemary on the windowsill, and the morning light coming in from the east exactly as she had known it would. Tobias had a habit, in the summer evenings, of walking to the north fence line of the property after dinner to look at the sky before dark. Alice had noticed it in the first summer and recognized it, because her father had done the same thing in his garden, for the same reason, and she had not said so for a long time because some things did not need to be said. One evening in the summer of 1883, she walked out to find him, William and Alina both asleep, and she stood beside him at the north fence with the evening sky enormous above them, the Kansas sky that was like no other sky in any direction because there was simply so much of it. "My father used to watch the light change every evening," she said. "I think I told you." "You did," he said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, the familiar solid warmth of him, the man she knew as well as she knew her own hands and was still, after 5 years, glad to look at. He was just grateful, she said, for being there to see it. Tobias looked at the sky for a moment. "It is a very good reason," he said. The light changed over the Beckett section, over the wheat fields and the garden and the barn and the cabin and the 2 sleeping children inside it, and it changed over Harlan Creek 4 miles west and over the churchyard where 2 graves sat side by side under a cottonwood tree, and it changed over the Cimarron Flats and the dry creek bed where the rocks could turn a horse's foot wrong, and over the 12 miles of flat country between the one and the other. Alice Ralston Collier stood at her north fence in the summer evening and was grateful, for all of it, for the whole long chain of it, and she held onto her husband's arm and watched the sky go from gold to rose to the first pale blue of the approaching dark, and the stars came out one by one over the wide Kansas country, and they stood there together until the evening was complete. Later, walking back to the cabin through the warm summer dark, Tobias's hand in hers and the light from the kitchen window ahead of them like a lantern in the black, she thought one more time about a September afternoon and a man giving away his horse and walking alone into the flat afternoon. She thought about how she had not looked back. She thought about how she should have known from that first moment, from the way he said, "I know you will," about her returning the horse, from the certainty of it, from the quality of a man who gives away what is his without making much of the giving. She had known. She simply had not let herself know it fully until she was ready. The cabin door opened before them, and the warmth came out, and she could hear Alina making the preliminary sound that meant she was about to wake, and William's voice saying something in his half-asleep mumble, and the ordinary familiar sounds of their life waiting for them inside the warm lit room. She walked through the door with her husband and she was home. It was exactly enough. It was, in every possible measure, more than enough. It was the whole argument against pessimism, living and breathing and growing in the Kansas night, deeply rooted and entirely unwilling to stop.